One area of agreement must be that our budget and appropriation process is broken. This sentiment isn't new at all, nor is it particularly partisan.
When it comes to the government's budget, it seems clear that our approval and appropriation processes don't work.
After weeks of failed attempts, lots of finger pointing and negotiating, they have struck an agreement in principle to avoid economic disaster.
And that our debt keeps growing.
The nation's deficit took a dramatic turn for the worse.
The current $31.4 trillion debt is more than the economies of China, Japan, Germany, and the UK combined, and equals more than $200,000 for every U.S. taxpayer.
So what should be done?
There's no process here. We haven't done a budget that we've adhered to since the late 90s.
I think the path forward is pass a dadgum budget.
If Americans can barely agree on nothing else, we should be able to agree that much of the bitterness and political tribalism that drives our public discussions is unhealthy for our country. In order to debate contentious public policy issues in a respectful and engaging manner without abandoning deeply held principles, the Cato Institute, in collaboration with the Brookings Institution, present Sphere.
According to the Pete Peterson Foundation, the current national debt is now more than $32 trillion. That's the number 32, followed by 12 zeros. It's a staggering sum. How should we understand this situation, and is this driving us toward a crisis or not? And if we do want to do something about it, what are the political implications? Joining us to unpack these questions are Romina Boccia, Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy here at the Cato Institute, Molly Reynolds, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, and Veronique de Rugy, George Gibbs Chair in Political Economy and Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center. Panelists, thank you so much for joining today. I think where we wanted to begin the conversation is to talk a little bit about understanding the current situation and how we got here, right? So we've spent $32 trillion more than we've raised in revenue. That's interesting as an approach. So how did that come about? And how do we start to understand what got us into this situation?
So I like to start this conversation by just doing a little bit of level setting so we're clear on kind of what we're talking about. And so the first thing that I want to be clear about is that the majority of federal spending, so that is the outer ring, that spending is spending that Congress does not make decisions about on a year-to-year basis. That spending is things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. That is about 2/3 of what the federal government spends in a year, and that runs largely, not exclusively, but largely on autopilot. So when we think about the challenges of our debt and deficit situation, one thing we want to be clear about is that most of what the government spends, Congress is not making decisions about on an annual basis. Second thing I want to note, that sort of in the middle ring on this figure, the one that says discretionary, that is what Congress makes decisions about on an annual basis. About 55% of that spending is defense spending, and about 45% of that is non-defense spending. So when we talk about sort of what our priorities are, when Congress debates that, that's sort of roughly where they've come down over time. The third thing that I'll say is that it's, I think, really important to be clear about what is driving these overall levels of spending and what's not driving them. So I noted that big outside circle is spending on things that Congress largely, again, does not touch from year to year. But things like earmarks, things like foreign aid, lots of things that we talk a lot about as being kind of politically contentious are, at the end of the day, actually not that much of what the federal government spends time on. And then the last thing I'll say is that one of the great challenges, and I'll sort of turn it over to my co-panelists from here, in dealing with the fact that what's on the outlays side of this is bigger than what's on the revenue side, I think this is roughly to scale, is that Congress is not well equipped to make hard long-term choices. Members of Congress in the House, re-elected every 2 years, in the Senate, re-elected every 6 years, and so their time horizon for what is important to think about simply often does not account for changes that will address a much longer-term fiscal health of the country. So just sort of putting those starting points on the table, and then I'll turn it over to my co-panelists to talk a little bit more about kind of how we got here.
Can I just briefly disagree on one point, Molly? Because I think points of contention maybe are interesting as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is that while the overall size of earmarks isn't nearly as large as most of this other spending that Congress is doing, I do think that they have outsized influence in terms of acting as a currency within Congress to get members of Congress to vote for, say, larger spending bills than they otherwise might be inclined to vote for spending bills that contain a lot of stuff that they disagree with, to overlook the fact that Congress is abusing emergency spending as a category to just plus up discretionary spending because they get something very salient that maybe even will lead to a ribbon cutting and to a special interest group in their district cheering them on, so they can justify, bad decisions because they got a little something good out of it.
Yeah, the other thing I will add is this is a really great setting on the outlay side, but if you ask why are we getting, why are we in this position, right, is like if you look at the green thing, it's like basically Congress, years after years after years after years, have made the decision to spend above and beyond what they collect in taxes. For the federal government, it's okay to do it a little bit, and certainly okay to do it during emergency spending, but it's not okay to do it repeatedly every year when the economy is growing, when there are no emergencies, when there are no wars, when we are at peace, where interest rates are low, and that is actually a big problem. It's like because interest rates are low, people have the feeling that, oh, well, it doesn't cost that much to overspend. And while you can go on when you're the US doing this a lot and accumulating $32 trillion in debt, right? You can do this. Obviously, we've managed to do it without much consequences. The question, the reason why we care about the debt is always about how long can we get away with that kind of behavior, right? So depending on which side of the debate you are, like someone like me would say, for instance, see what you can collect in taxes and then adjust your spending to match roughly what you can collect in spending. Other people would say, well, no, actually, we need to get the taxes to match the spending. But in the end, what matters for debt is this disconnect. And what matters is how long we can get away with having that disconnect, not only over time, but a disconnect that is actually between revenue and outlays that's growing, right, without dramatic consequences. And so that's kind of the type of thing. And also, as Molly has said, politicians don't want to be thinking about that question.
So I think all of you have shared in some capacity or the other, we spend a lot of money, we bring in a lot of money in revenue, and you've suggested all as well that there's something about this that's concerning, right? That we think it's going to be problematic in some way. I wonder if you might, each of you share a little bit of thoughts about the magnitude by which we ought to be concerned, right? So many of us in the room, we remember what happened in Greece not all that long back, the sort of catastrophic consequences of when spending in debt exceeded the ability of the country to respond accordingly. Is that something that's on the table here? Is it more on the table if we see something like slower growth? What are we really talking about when we worry about excessive spending and debt year after year after year?
Sure. So I think for me, the biggest, I'm not sure I can sort of say, should we be Greece levels of concern? But for me, the biggest concern is not so much how out of balance this is, but how ill-equipped our political system at present really is to deal with what will be growing challenges in the future. Some of that, again, has to do with kind of the time horizon that's baked into being a member of Congress. Some of it has to do with the fact that voters are sort of much more sensitive to losing things than they are to gaining things. So when you sort of are able to run a political campaign that says, so-and-so voted to cut Medicare or cut Social Security, that's how sensitive voters are to those messages means that it's very hard to get members of Congress to kind of make decisions that are going to rework this balance. And then there's little that I see in the political system that suggests that that's going to change. So sort of charting a way to compromise, I think, is really challenging. And so that's what worries me the most about how we ensure that we are able to sort of continue to meet the needs and the arising challenges that face the country.
I'll add something about that, which is on top of that, we have a budget process. So the process by which the number in the middle is decided, that's small enough, but that budget process is broken. And it's kind of a cliche sentence to say it's broken. So what does it mean? It means that there are rules. Actually, we're coming on the 50th anniversary of the Budget Process Act that set those rules in place. There are rules that are supposed to actually dictate how the budget is adopted, what level Congress, whether Republicans, Democrats, needs to abide for. They need to set their own limits and all this. And these guys just don't follow it. Literally, they don't follow it. Colleagues, one of your colleagues at the Brookings Institution 4 years ago wrote a book, and in there was a striking statistic, which I bet you is still accurate right now. In the 50 years that the budget process has been in place, setting those rules for the budget process, only 4 times, 4 years, has Congress follow its own rule. And what it means is when everyone ignores the rule, what you're going to have is you're going to have a system where there's way more fights, right? Where the minority party, the only way they can take the floor and have a say is by basically using the debt ceiling as a way to get what they want, or shut down the government, or this or that. It means you have people fighting over a shrinking size of the budget, and that too is conducive to more fights.
But to come back to your original question, how concerned should we be? I think of it as like 3 possible outcomes. The Greece-like scenario is the most unlikely scenario because unlike Greece, we actually print our own currency. So before we have investors cutting us off, we're more likely to suffer much higher inflation as the government tries to monetize the debt. So the idea is that the US government can always pay its debts because it creates its own money, but that has consequences such as higher inflation. And one way to think of inflation is that it's a way to tax the population, especially lower and middle class people who are more likely to have whatever savings they might have in bank accounts rather than in the marketplace. To tax them by indirect means, by reducing the value of the currency in their bank account because everything has become more expensive, but it also reduces the value of the debt, so it makes it easier for the government to pay the debt with this newly issued currency. So that's one scenario. In the United States context, we also have the added difficulty that we are the world's reserve currency, which allows us to borrow more for longer at lower rates because there isn't really another currency in the world that plays the role that the US dollar and US Treasury bonds play in terms of facilitating global market exchanges and acting as a cash reserve for governments that are trying to signal credibility by using the US dollar. But that also means that when such an alternative emerges, a serious alternative to the US dollar, those benefits that we currently reap could go away. We can go from this is sustainable for now to all of a sudden, wow, now there's another currency in town, dollar reserves are dropping globally, and we suffer severe inflation because the dollars that used to live abroad all of a sudden come home. And now we have a lot more money in the US economy than we were expecting, and that is going to be very difficult for the Federal Reserve to fix. With the worst case scenario being that the dollar becomes so severely devalued that perhaps we need to change currency, like other countries have had to do that. So that's, I think, the most severe scenario. Of all of those, I think the most likely is that we're going to be more stagnant, slow growing, and the real implications are sort of hidden, unseen costs where we suffer from less innovation, less income in people's pockets, fewer opportunities for the next generation to build businesses, to realize their full potential. And I think those are things we should worry maybe perhaps more about than a severe fiscal crisis, because at least a severe fiscal crisis is like a sudden, a dramatic thing that will certainly rattle legislators to make changes. But a slow-growing economy where we don't live as long as we otherwise would, and we have lower living standards than we otherwise would, is something that we could sustain for quite some time, and people might not be able to necessarily figure out that it's the high debt that's driving those consequences, and so we might go on missing out on better living standards and higher growth for longer than we otherwise would.
Can I just, underline something that Veronique said about the process that allocates kind of the middle ring on the outlay side. So that is the process that Congress goes through every year, the annual appropriations process. And regardless of whether you think that that bar is too big or too small, or you think that the allocation across non-defense spending versus defense spending is off kilter, what I think we can all agree on is that the process that decides the size of that bar has become captured by all of the other political dysfunction facing the current US Congress. So the way that I sometimes think about this is it's like a giant game of whack-a-mole. So members of Congress come to Washington with things that they want to accomplish. And as the overall legislative process becomes more dysfunctional and it becomes harder to get things done, the process that allocates that amount of the federal budget, that keeps chugging along in some way, because if it doesn't, that's when we see a partial government shutdown. We've all sort of lived through several of those in the last decade or so. And so we treat that process as kind of a must-pass process. Congress needs to do it. And so it just becomes this target for all of the other political fights about things that are largely tangential to the federal budget, and that makes it harder to make responsible choices, regardless of which direction you want those choices to go. It makes it harder to make them because there are all these other fights that are not really about how much should we spend on X versus how much should we spend on Y that are kind of derailing that process.
So let's talk a little bit about what makes this so particularly difficult to challenge in the current circumstances. And you'd mentioned earlier some of the structural challenges in the way that the system operates. There's some political challenges involved as well. So what makes this hard to do something about it now? And then let's transition the conversation as well to talk about what might be possible. How do we think about start moving towards solutions?
Sure. So I've already shared with you what I see as some of the biggest structural challenges. In the 1980s and 1990s, the most powerful legislative tool available to the US Congress for addressing the deficit was something called budget reconciliation. That term is not important. What is important is that it is a legislative procedure that allows for a simple majority to move things through the Senate. It means that things are not subject to the possibility of a filibuster, that they need 60 votes. As the political system has gotten more polarized, as it's become harder and harder to build large legislative coalitions, this tool That for a while was the way that Congress sort of, everyone held hands and jumped to address the deficit when doing so is involves making cuts that can be unpopular. It's morphed into a way for legislators to try and achieve party priorities on a party line basis. We had at our disposal a legislative procedure that was useful for addressing the deficit that has migrated away from that as we've had bigger changes in the political systems.
Romina, what would you add? And I know you have a whole variety of interesting thoughts about how we might be able to overcome some of these.
Yeah, so one thing I really worry about is that for the two of the largest programs that make up about half of the federal budget now, Social Security and Medicare, for both Medicare and Social Security, you have this like built-in deadline where Congress will have to take action. And for Social Security, the latest projections were that that will happen in 2033. Of course, again, subject to projections and economic fluctuations. And for Medicare, I think it's 2031, but then it got moved back. So again, it depends on how much money actually goes out. But if we wait for this, like right now, it seems like a lot of legislators are thinking, we don't need to do anything about this until we run up against the deadline about 10 years from now. But if we wait until we're at the deadline, there's really only two solutions that will avoid immediate benefit cuts. And I think we can all put our money on wherever we can bet on this, that Congress will not allow immediate benefit cuts to take place. And so what are those two options? Tax increases on working Americans by increasing the payroll tax, or just more deficit financing, which then will likely drive up interest costs and obviously will further drive up the debt. By waiting, we're really running out of options to make more rational, sensible choices that are fairer for working Americans and also fair for the seniors that are on the receiving end of these benefits. I think one thing that's interesting too in this discussion, often there's this assumption that reducing benefits will mean actual benefit cuts to the current benefits that people receive. But in some ways, what we're actually trying to do is reduce the growth in benefits. For example, if we froze the current Social Security benefit and only adjusted it for inflation, we could fix most of the Social Security problem. The main issue is that the Social Security is becoming more generous each and every year because it's indexed to wages. That's one reason, and also the inflation adjustment is overstated. And with Medicare, the Medicare subsidies is becoming more generous each and every year. The cost per person for Medicare continues to go up faster than medical inflation because there's new services and new procedures and new machines that hospitals acquire. Now, how do we overcome that? I've sort of this sounds bad perhaps, but I've kind of given up on Congress holding hands and making these choices together. I think the more likely scenario is going to have to be an independent commission that Congress empowers on its behalf to make those decisions. Maybe it's time for a fiscal commission to step in and help us, because even the debt limit debate only dealt with roughly 30% of the budget, 3 out of every $10 that the government spends. And then the other $7 weren't even on the negotiating table. But that's where the big problem lies. So I think we need to seriously discuss about delegating this to a commission that Congress empowers to get the job done and get the politics out of it.
I'm not giving up on bipartisanship, even though part of me hates it because it means everyone loses, right? Something, right? It's like a lot of the compromise means everyone has to give something. So it means I'm not gonna love it, but I think this is important to say in the context of this workshop, which is about civility and discourse. Congress needs to relearn, and we need to demand that they work together. Because culture, remember, politics is downstream of culture. So we can't just look at what's happening in Washington and feel that we have no role to play. I know we all have our political views, we all have, but one thing is sure, these problems are not going to be addressed if it's not in a bipartisan way where everyone is willing to actually compromise. They will not do it if they don't think that you guys will reward them for working together. So, you know, I'm just kind of want to be the optimist in the room. But I want to remind you, you have an incredibly important role to play.
One of the goals for Sphere is thinking about how we can return facts and analysis and reason to the conversation when dealing with challenging and divisive conversations. I'm thrilled that the three of you were able to join us and be able to bring this point of view to what is a challenging and particularly difficult conversation. With that, please join me in thanking the panel for being here today.